Hey, welcome back. This is History 115, week 12, lecture number 2. Today we're going to be talking about the Nixon visit to China and a bit about China after Mao, heading towards the 1980s and the era of Deng Xiaoping. Let me put your terms up here on the board. So containment policy, we have Nixon and Kissinger, Zhou and Lai, ping pong diplomacy we'll be talking about in the Shanghai Communique. Then the era of Deng and his slogan, seek truth from facts, etc. So let's see, where should we start? First, a few quick announcements for the class. No class on Monday because it's Patriots Day. It probably doesn't feel like a holiday since you're still stuck at home. But we won't have class on Monday because there are no UMass classes on Monday. Next Wednesday, again, we have that change to the syllabus. Originally, we were scheduled for an exam. Instead, there will be a movie for you to watch, a documentary about the Cultural Revolution. And details will come on that as soon as the library is finished uploading the DVD to their servers. And then finally, the third paper topic is up on Moodle. You can get to work on that whenever you feel ready. And a review sheet for the final exam will be posted before long. Okay. So back to the era of the Cultural Revolution. This time I want to look more widely at relations with the United States. So during the Cultural Revolution, it was an era, I mean, we've talked about this for a good part of 2 lectures already. So, you know, this is an era of anti-intellectualism, hatred of foreigners. The Red Guards attacked embassies in Beijing. They burned the British embassy to the ground. They attacked the Russian embassy because the Russians were the revisionists who had taken the wrong road of communism. And at the peak of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, 1967, China broke off ties with most countries in the world and pulled back its ambassadors. So during this era of the Cultural Revolution, China really turned in on itself, pulled back its ambassadors, cut off diplomacy with the outside world. But a major shift is going to come as a result of the Sino-Soviet split. So let's talk a little bit about how Americans saw the Cultural Revolution from where they stood. Initially, the only information anyone really had was propaganda images, film strips and things like that, that showed a very positive image of what was happening in China. So from the outside, it seemed like it was China's attempt to get, to undo the socialist bureaucracy that many people thought was a part of this Red Menace, to ensure the power of the people. It seemed generally positive. There were films about brave Chinese reinventing their society, undoing the old class structures. And at this, again, by the late 1960s, there was a really strong idealized support from the left in America. So people on the left-hand side of the political spectrum in the US, if they were mistrustful of capitalism, Mao's China seemed like an alternative. You still can find pockets of that. Also in the United States, on the right, you have strong anti-communist opposition to communism of any stripe, be it Soviet or Chinese or any other. And as the anti-communists saw it, all of the commies were the same, and they were all trying to take over the world. This was the Red Menace of the Cold War. And as I said at the end of the last lecture, Richard Nixon was elected in 1968 on an explicitly anti-communist platform. He was one of the chief commie haters. And therefore, there was total and utter shock when it was announced in July of 1971 that Nixon was going to go to China. He was going to meet with Mao, and they were going to enter into negotiations for a new kind of relationship. Here they are. This, after 22 years since the Korean War, after 22 years of the US and mainland China being mortal enemies, this handshake here, as I said last time, it became known as the handshake that shook the world. Almost overnight, the US and China went from being enemies to being friends and allies. So how did this come about? It was completely unexpected, both in China and in the United States. Well, we have to roll back a little bit to find the path leading to this. The US had initially considered diplomatic recognition for the PRC since 1949, when it became clear that they were going to win the Civil War. However, and at the time also, I should say that when they won the Civil War, it looked very likely that mainland China would succeed in taking Taiwan as well. And so there wouldn't even be a Chiang Kai-shek for the US to support. In 1949, the PRC did not seem a direct threat to America's interests, only insofar as America supported Chiang Kai-shek. That possibility of opening diplomatic relations ended firmly with the Korean War in 1950. And that led to a vision of just a communist bloc covering all of Asia, from the USSR through Red China, dedicated to the overthrow of Western democracies. And this sparked real fear in the West of China and everything it represented. And here I'm going to give you a new map to look at here. This is a school map. This is from 1966 for the use of American schools. And the title is Communist China, not to be confused with Uncommunist China, which means Taiwan. And so here we have Red China, conveniently drawn in red, and you have sort of this sort of fortune cookie font for Communist China to give a little whiff of exoticism. But to look a little closer at what is this map teaching the school children who look at it. First of all, you have Red China's top 5 men. Here I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. You have Mao and Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai. Those are the big ones who last. But more importantly, you know, China is a nation wrapped in conflict and has this huge population, 750 million, the largest in the world. It has a huge territory. It talks about the Great Leap Forward, which saw industrial development given top priority over agriculture, leading to famine conditions, nearly ruining the Red regime. All through this, it's the Red regime. So what do we have to stand up to this Red menace? We have American military bases almost completely surrounding it. So here, Taiwan, which is our bulwark. This is where Chiang Kai-shek is in the 1960s. And anti-communist Chinese troops, those are Chiang Kai-shek's troops, and the US 7th Fleet sailing back and forth through the Strait of Taiwan. In the Philippines, we have American and other anti-communist forces. In South Vietnam, we have US and other anti-communist forces. Same in Thailand, same in South Korea, same in Japan, US troops and naval forces. All of this, and let's back up again, is what came to be known as the containment policy of the United States vis-a-vis China. So America's containment policy was to effectively surround China with American troops and other anti-communist troops in order to prevent Red China from expanding. This was in the late 1950s and the 1960s. This was the centerpiece of American policy towards China. Containing it, trying to prevent it from expanding into neighboring countries. And again, the threat of this era, it's sort of this vision of this brainwashed population of communists, and if they're allowed to spread, they'll brainwash everyone else, and soon everybody will become these mindless communists. If you've ever seen the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that's an allegory about communism, that everyone sort of turns into these robots. So this was the fear. This was, I mean, even as late as when I was in 7th grade, my geography textbook, and it was completely out of date by that point, but we had old textbooks. It was a poor school. In my geography textbook, it showed all of the Soviet Union and China as an unbroken swath of red. And this was the Red menace that was dedicating itself to the overthrow of Western democracy. So by the 1950s, in the US, you have total contempt for the communists in China. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, thought communism was immoral and threatening. The US strongly opposed the PRC's participation in the UN. Mao wanted to be part of the UN. The US led the way in blocking it. There was one China seat for the UN, and Taiwan had that, the Republic of China. As I said, the U.S. beefed up its military bases in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Thailand, South Vietnam, all of these areas around the periphery of China in order to keep it contained. Meanwhile, expertise in the United States waned. During the McCarthy era, which most of you should know from your US history classes in the 1950s, Senator McCarthy attacked the State Department specifically for the so-called loss of China. What was the loss of China? That meant at the end of World War II, when Chiang Kai-shek lost the mainland, this was America's loss of China. And in the views of McCarthy and others like him, they believed that the US and Chiang Kai-shek should have been successful in the Civil War and in defeating communism in China, but they had failed because somebody had betrayed them. And McCarthy pinpointed the US diplomats in the State Department as being the scapegoats for that. So everyone in the State Department who actually knew something about China generally was purged and removed from their jobs. This removed a whole generation of China experts from the United States. These were, who were these experts? A lot of them had grown up in China. These were Americans who were children of missionaries or other Americans who were living in China. They had grown up in China. Some had grown up in the countryside. They spoke fluent Chinese. They understood the political system in China. They lost their jobs in the McCarthy era. Ironically, this is around the same time as the anti-rightist campaign in China, where China was getting rid of everyone who had contact with the West and who had contact with the KMT. Meanwhile, in the US, they're removing all of the experts who know something about China, leaving both sides in real ignorance of the realities of the other. So going forward through the 50s and into the 60s, Washington threatened to nuke China if it attacked Taiwan. Taiwan became America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. The Kennedy administration, we think of him as being fairly liberal. John F. Kennedy continued the containment policy, continued the policy of trying to keep military forces around the edges of China to keep it from expanding into other countries. President Eisenhower allegedly threatened to come out of retirement if Kennedy changed anything with that. Anyhow, all of this goes along this period of Cold War enmity, hatred, military buildup. But then comes the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s. And with the falling out between China and the Soviet Union, it became possible that maybe there wasn't really just one unbroken swath of red across all of Eurasia. Maybe there wasn't just one communist bloc trying to take over the world. And that split, that rift between the Chinese and the Soviets that we talked about previously, suggested that China was not just the lapdog of the Soviet Union. So let's go back to this map here. This map is 1966. This is when the Sino-Soviet split is underway. And you can see that happily for the map makers, the containment of China is now complete. You have hostile forces in India blocking Chinese expansion there. And then you go up north, and here you have Soviet troops protect areas coveted by Peking. There have been frequent clashes between Soviet and Chinese border guards along the frontier. So here along the border with the Soviet Union, you have hostile forces containing China from that direction. And then even in the Mongolian People's Republic, you have Soviet troops that have moved into Mongolia and again are blockading China. So by the time this map was made in 1966, it was possible to imagine that China was completely contained by US-led forces all along the coast, by the Soviets in the north, and by the Indians in the southwest. So with this rift, it seemed an opportunity that if the Soviet Union and China were at loggerheads, if they were possibly going to be at war with each other, the US could potentially pick one side or another. But to go with one side would inevitably anger the other side. And furthermore, during the early part of the Sino-Soviet split, peace with Russia was more important for the US than peace with China. There was a constant threat of nuclear war between the Soviet Union and America. That was the biggest problem for American policymakers. And Kennedy also incidentally considered a joint attack with the Russians to get at China's nuclear program to prevent them from getting missiles as well. Let's move forward. By the late 1960s, America was completely embroiled in the war in Vietnam, and it had no energy left to think about China. China, furthermore, by the late 60s, had turned inward on itself with the Cultural Revolution, and people didn't really know what was going on there. So why a rapprochement? Why did this come about? There was a shifting tide of American sentiment towards China after 1969. Largely as a result of the anti-war movement and sort of the antagonism to a conservative U.S. government and its policies. So the anti-war movement, all of your former, your predecessors at the UMass campus marching around in the anti-war marches with their long hair, many of them had favorable visions of China because they were angry about U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. They thought the U.S. should get out, and they refused to see China as an enemy in that war. On a more sort of coldly calculated level, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, he sort of calculated that America could use China as a lever against Russia. As Kissinger saw the world, he saw it in terms of a balance of power, that there were great powers in the world that balanced each other off. And after World War II, right after World War II, it was a bipolar world. There was a Soviet Union and there was the United States. By the late 60s, Kissinger saw there being 5 major centers of power. So there was the Soviet Union still, of course. There was the United States. There was Western Europe. There was Japan. And China was the 5th power, except that China was still isolated from the world. Kissinger decided that China should be opened, and it appeared that Russia was not about to do it. So America had a chance to open China on its side in the Cold War. And amazingly, despite being such an ardent anti-communist, Nixon went along with Kissinger's arguments. And the reality of all of this is that only a president as far right as Richard Nixon could have pulled this off. That any liberal president who tried to cozy up to China would have been torn to pieces by the conservatives. Only a far-right Republican anti-communist president like Nixon could bring his own party along with all of the liberals who were already on board with making nice to China and trying to fix the problems in their relationship. So what about China? Why did Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai open up to the U.S.? First of all, Mao saw U.S. relations as a means of finally joining the UN. Mao wanted China to play an important role in the world, and only through the UN could they do this. So it seemed like a way to get into the United Nations. Most importantly, it was a way of using the U.S. against the Soviets. Now, these border clashes out in Xinjiang, which are noted on this map, and there have been frequent clashes along the border. These become especially fierce by late 1969. And China didn't have enough troops. I mean, at least 1 million troops were sent to the border region. Huge numbers of troops were sent by the Soviet Union as well. But this border is so long and so threatening to China, there was a real possibility of either the Soviets or the Chinese resorting to nuclear weapons in this war. China prepared for an all-out war with Russia, again, sending huge numbers of troops to the border region, and city dwellers across China were told to dig bomb shelters, fallout shelters, in preparation for a possible nuclear war. These were huge shelters dug underground in most of China's major cities. A lot of them, incidentally, later on got turned into underground shopping centers once they were no longer needed for defense from the Soviets. In the midst of all this, in March of 1969, the Soviet premier tried to call Zhou Enlai in the midst of a border clash out here on the border of Xinjiang. But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had been taken over by Red Guards. Those who hadn't been sent off to the countryside were still there. The Red Guard operator who took the phone call would not let the Soviet premier talk to Zhou Enlai, shouted at him, "We do not speak to revisionists," and hung up. Once Zhou Enlai found out that this had happened, this seemed like a real emergency situation. So a rapprochement with the US, according to China, in the eyes of China's leaders, was a way of reopening to the world and hopefully preventing a war with the Soviet Union. So leaders on both sides saw value in opening up to each other. So you have Nixon and Kissinger on one side, you have Mao and Zhou Enlai as their companions on the other side. But what do you do about the public? The American public have been sold on this image of the Chinese as their enemies for years, ever since the Korean War. Similarly, the Chinese have been taught that the American imperialists are evil to their bones and their only dream is to destroy the hopes of communist China. How do you reach out to the public and encourage them to look more favorably on the other country? How do you bring the people together? And this is what brings us to ping-pong diplomacy, as it is known. And I will let Forrest Gump tell us a little bit about it here. Again, this is a fictional movie, but it gives you a sense of like how big this event was when it happened. So Forrest Gump, for any of you who have seen the movie, he gets to be part of everything in the 1960s. He gets to be part of ping-pong diplomacy. Let's take a look here.
I thought I was going back to Vietnam, but instead they decided the best way for me to fight the communists was to play ping pong. So I was in the special services, traveling around the country, cheering up all them wounded veterans and showing them how to play ping pong. I was so good that some years later, the Army decided that I should be on the All-America ping pong team. We were the first Americans to visit the land of China in like a million years or something like that. Somebody said world peace was in our hands. But all I did was play ping pong. When I got home, I was a national celebrity, famouser even than Captain Kangaroo.
Okay, famouser even than Captain Kangaroo. Here, let me put the map back on. So ping pong diplomacy was an invitation to the American ping pong team to come and play a game in China. This was in April of 1971. And what ping pong diplomacy represented was people-to-people diplomacy. The term is still used today. Ping pong diplomacy means bringing ordinary people together from the countries instead of having the leaders meet each other. Ping pong diplomacy was a prelude to the Nixon visit. This is well before Nixon's visit was actually announced. It was suddenly Red China, which had been closed for so long, issued this unexpected invitation. This was issued by Mao and Zhou Enlai to the US ping pong team, which had been playing in Japan, to come over to China and play a match. This threw everybody into a tizzy. US passports at the time actually said explicitly not valid for travel to the People's Republic of China. And the head of the embassy in Tokyo had to take a black magic marker and cross out all of those lines in all the passports of all of the ping pong players on the US team. But they went and they had great games. And the Chinese won. They were better at ping pong. Forrest Gump was holding his own. But the important thing of all of this is that it was a rapprochement through sports, through a game that both countries played, something that was sort of combative but in a playful, friendly way. And in those images that were beamed back of the ping pong players playing and of the ping pong, the athletes from China smiling and happy, Americans were taught that maybe the Chinese weren't so bad after all. Maybe we could be friends with them. And what began with a series of ping pong matches would expand with Nixon's visit, and ultimately it would mean an era of lots of students and artists and people being brought back and forth between the two countries, something that continues on to this day. This people-to-people diplomacy as an attempt to try to build a better sense in each country of its friendship with the others. So February 18th, 1972, Nixon made his trip to China. I'll put him back up on here if I can find him. No. Nixon, incidentally, is still the most beloved U.S. president in China, even though nobody likes him in America anymore, really. He has his afterlife in China, where he's really responsible for the modern U.S.-China relationship. A whole press corps went over with him. They beamed television images back to the U.S. Things were timed carefully. It was a 12-hour time difference. So banquets that were held at 8 in the evening in China, where they were toasting each other and smiling or going for a walk, those could be shown at breakfast time in the United States. And Americans crowded around their televisions to get their first real images of Red China and seeing it for the first time as a friend. This potential friendship between Mao, the leader of the Chinese communists, and Nixon, the leader of the anti-communist Americans, smiling at each other, shaking hands. They took tours to the Great Wall. They had banquets together. Nixon fumbled with his chopsticks. The Western press corps ran rampant during and after the visit. They went running all over to take pictures and films of school children playing in markets. And side note, all of this was stage managed by China. So the markets that the American press corps went and filmed that were full of vegetables, they had been packed full of vegetables in preparation for the press corps coming. The children that they met with who were playing had been carefully chosen and prepared for their meetings. The US press doesn't seem to quite have appreciated how much all of this was being managed, but it served an important end, which was to teach Americans that the Chinese were not robots. They were not brainwashed ants. They were people, just like us. They smiled. They played games. They were friendly. Here was 750 million new friends opening themselves up. And so what began with the ping pong diplomacy then turned into a state visit, and then turned into, almost overnight, relatively speaking, a new friendship between China and the United States. So what was accomplished here? The main thing that was accomplished, and it's in your documents reader, you're reading it for this Friday, is the Shanghai Communique. It is impossible to understate the importance of this document. I have a little photocopy of it here. The Shanghai Communique, which was hashed out by Chinese and US diplomats, and this was an agreement between Mao and Nixon at the end of the visit. This is the foundation of US-China relations to the present day. Any issue between the US and China having to do with recognition of Taiwan or anything like that boils down to the wording of this document. And I just want to read to you the especially brilliant part of this. Brilliant in terms of diplomacy. Diplomacy meaning taking two states with very different views and very different goals and trying to find common ground, trying to find some sort of phrasing that they can both agree on. So the big issue in US-China relations, as you know, was Taiwan. The fact that America had been supporting Chiang Kai-shek. Here, I'll put the regular map back up on here. Here we are. This issue of Taiwan, that ever since during and after the Civil War, the United States had supported Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan, had recognized Taiwan as being the Republic of China, and the Republic of China having the seat in the UN, whereas mainland China claimed it as a province of its own country that was still held in the hands of its enemy from the Civil War. So essentially, the Civil War still had not ended by the time Nixon went to China. So listen to the language here and how they talk about Taiwan, because it's this language that allowed them to build a new relationship in spite of America's continued military support for Taiwan. So, reading from the Shanghai Communique, the two sides reviewed the long-standing serious disputes between China and the United States. The Chinese side, so we begin with how China sees it. The Chinese side reaffirmed its position. The Taiwan question is the crucial question obstructing the normalization of relations between China and the United States. Incidentally, normalizing relations means sending ambassadors to each other's country, recognizing each other as a country. At this point in time, there was no US ambassador in China. The US ambassador was in Taipei, in Taiwan. Okay, so the main obstacle to normalizing relations between China and the US is Taiwan. So the Chinese side continues. The government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. Taiwan is a province of China which has long been returned to the motherland. The liberation of Taiwan is China's internal affair in which no other country has a right to interfere. Okay, so the Chinese position is there is only one government for China. Taiwan is a part of China, and therefore the liberation of Taiwan, as they put it, meaning bringing Taiwan back to the motherland, is an internal affair of China's. It is not an international affair, and therefore the solution to this problem has to be internal to China, and no foreign country has a right to interfere in that. This is still the policy of mainland China today. This is why you have that heavy dotted line around let me find it. Yeah, this is why you have this heavy dotted line around Taiwan in maps made in mainland China to show that Taiwan is a part of China, even if it happens to still be under this renegade government left over from the Civil War. Okay, so the Chinese side has made its view explicit. Here is the US side, crafted by Henry Kissinger. Again, a model of diplomatic language, because obviously the US doesn't really agree with all of this. Here is what the US agrees to. It says, the US side declared, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. So the US does not say Taiwan is a part of China. The US says we recognize that the Chinese living in mainland China believe that Taiwan is a part of, that there is only one China and Taiwan is a part of it. And we also acknowledge that the Chinese in Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek believe there is only one China and that Taiwan should be ruling the rest of it. So in other words, they acknowledge that both sides believe there is just one China, and both sides want to rule all of it. So the mainland wants to reoccupy Taiwan, and Taiwan wants to reinvade the mainland. The US simply acknowledges that all of the Chinese on both sides believe there is just one China. Furthermore, it says the US government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. So the US says that we acknowledge that you all believe you are one China, even if you're not sure which side is going to govern it. And we affirm our interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question. And it goes on. And essentially the United States promises not to interfere in the relationship between Taiwan and mainland China as long as it is peaceful. And that language is in there specifically. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. So the US, in the Shanghai Communique, promises to be hands-off as long as the situation is peaceful between China and Taiwan. This leaves an opening that if mainland China attacks Taiwan, America can help them militarily and intervene because it is no longer a peaceful situation. Similarly, this document allows the United States to open diplomatic relations with mainland China while still arming Taiwan. And they're going to keep selling billions and billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwan to protect itself from an attack across the straits. To this day, the United States is still selling billions of dollars of planes and high-tech weaponry to Taiwan to protect itself from a potential invasion from mainland China. Nobody in Taiwan is still talking about regaining the mainland. That's long past. But this region, the Taiwan Strait, still continues as a very, very important and potentially dangerous flashpoint in East Asia. That mainland China, the People's Republic, still maintains that it can recapture Taiwan, that Taiwan is a part of its country. And Taiwan knows that if it declares independence, and there are some political factions in Taiwan that would like to declare themselves an independent country, they know that if they do that, then mainland China will have justification to attack them. And if Taiwan provokes the attack by declaring independence, the US probably won't come to their aid. So this was the big deal, the Shanghai Communique. And as I said, it is still the foundation document for US-China relations today. After its signing, after this visit and all of the television and newspaper coverage, again, the United States and China became friends going forward from 1972. They started helping each other out. They started sending groups of students and artists and writers back and forth. The long view of this, China will join the United Nations and Taiwan will be booted out. There is still only one China seat in the United Nations. And the Nixon visit paved the way for for mainland China, the People's Republic, to take that seat and play the huge role that it plays today on the UN Security Council. Taiwan, meanwhile, gets shunted aside. By 1979, the US and China finally achieved normalization. This was after Mao was dead. I'll put Deng Xiaoping up here. Deng was the one who came to the US and negotiated the normalization. Deng, as you can see him here in a cowboy hat, this is one of the most famous images of Deng Xiaoping, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Here he is in Texas, showing that a Chinese leader can happily put on a cowboy hat and be partly American for a moment. Even though Deng, here he is in his Mao jacket, wearing his communist clothing, the head of the Communist Party of China, but wearing a 10-gallon hat from Texas, showing that he's friendly to the US as well. So normalization took place under Jimmy Carter in 1979. This was the occasion for Deng Xiaoping's visit to the US. And at the same time that the US normalized relations with China and opened up an embassy there, Carter sent a delegation to Taiwan to bring them the bad news that they were no longer normalized with the United States and that the US embassy would be shut down. This led to riots in Taipei. The US emissary, Warren Christopher, rioting demonstrators smashed the windows of his car, and it's still remembered in Taiwan as sort of the great betrayal by the United States. Because going forward from 1979 and continuing to this day, this is the situation between China and Taiwan and the United States. That today, the US embassy is in Beijing. The US State Department diplomats are in mainland China. When we say China, we mean mainland China. We mean the People's Republic of China. China has the seat in the UN. The US recognizes the PRC in Beijing as the sole legitimate government of China, even as it keeps arming Taiwan. As far as its relations with Taiwan, Taiwan now is almost completely isolated in the world because it is not considered a state. It does not have a place on the UN. It can print its own currency. It has its own democratic government. It has all of its own institutions. In almost every way, it operates as an independent country. However, it cannot call itself an independent country at risk of being invaded by the mainland. And other countries cannot recognize it as a country in its own right, except at the expense of relations with Beijing. So Taiwan is diplomatically isolated. There are foreign diplomats there. There is not a US embassy. There is, however, the American Institute in Taiwan, which, secret, is actually an embassy, but it can't call itself an embassy. It is a non-governmental organization. The head of the American Institute in Taiwan is actually an ambassador, but he can't be called an ambassador. The US State Department diplomats who are posted to Taiwan have to formally take a leave of absence from the US State Department, and then they are hired as temporary contractors by the American Institute in Taiwan, where they do pretty much what they do in any other country as diplomats, but they can't call themselves that. Similarly, Taiwan cannot participate in international events except under very strict naming policies set by Beijing. They can take part in the Olympics as Chinese Taipei, not as Taiwan. And this comes down to several years ago, there was a Miss Universe pageant in Sri Lanka, and a woman from Taiwan competed as Miss Taiwan, and again, diplomats from mainland China complained at their embassy in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka forced her to be changed to Miss Chinese Taipei as a way of not acknowledging them as a country. Taiwan has tried to collect little countries to recognize it. These are generally small, fairly poor countries that receive a large amount of foreign aid from Taiwan, and in return, they recognize it. And they are crucial to Taiwan because those little countries have seats in the UN that Taiwan doesn't have. And it's through those little countries that almost every year there is a resolution put before the UN to accept Taiwan, the Republic of China, as a member state in the UN, and every year it is voted down. Who are these countries? Palau, Paraguay. I was a Fulbrighter in Taiwan when I was in grad school, and I got to meet the ambassador from Paraguay. He had these huge epaulets and a hat with huge feathers on it. Who do they have? They have Burkina Faso. They had Macedonia, but they lost it. El Salvador. They had Vanuatu. It's a little island kingdom. They lost that as well. They had the Vatican because of Catholicism. The Vatican and Beijing were loggerheads. Now they've lost the Vatican. So Taiwan, even though it effectively exists as a state, cannot take part in international politics in the way that a regular state would. And this all still is a legacy of this of the Shanghai Communique and the continued policy assertion that there is one China and there can only be one China, and Taiwan is a part of it. So back to the 1980s and back to Deng Xiaoping. I'll put him back up on here because I love this photo of him. Whoops, here we are. So last time we had the death of Mao, 1976. He died soon after the Tangshan earthquake. Let's talk about what happens next going forward into the 1980s. It was Deng Xiaoping who managed to pull himself back to the top after Mao's death. There was another official who was Mao's designated successor, Hua Guofeng. You don't need to remember his name. He's in your textbook. But Deng Xiaoping managed to push him aside and put himself at the center. By 1978, Deng was back at the top. So who is Deng Xiaoping? As you can see from this picture, he is short. That is one thing he is known for. 5 feet tall, 5 foot even, extremely tough. Mao called him a needle in a ball of cotton. I love that description of him, a needle in a ball of cotton. Small but tough, and you don't want to mess with him. He was born in 1904, and he goes all the way back in the communist movement. He was part of the study abroad movement in France in the 19-teens. He was a veteran of the Long March. And he was there all the way through. He led the anti-rightist campaign. You'll see those documents in your reader, even though later in his life he would be attacked for being a rightist. But he led the anti-rightist campaign. He did not manage to survive in Mao's favor. He was purged twice, but he had extremely strong relations amongst high-level leaders in the party. When Mao purged him, Mao couldn't simply have him executed the way Stalin could do with his political enemies. He did not have the political power to do that. So even though Deng was purged twice, even though the Cultural Revolution was directed at him personally, along with Liu Shaoqi, still he survived it. Liu Shaoqi did not. As I said, he died in prison in 1969. But Deng Xiaoping makes it through these horrible times and being struggled and beaten and imprisoned to come back out. He gets rehabilitated after Mao's death, and as he moves up through the ranks, he surpasses Hua Guofeng by 1978, and as he rises back to the top, he brings along the people who were punished in the mass campaigns. He rehabilitates the people who were attacked in the Cultural Revolution. He forgives them. He rehabilitates the rightists from the anti-rightist campaign that he had originally led. And he presides over this huge trial of the Gang of Four, Jiang Qing and the 3 other intellectuals who were blamed for the Cultural Revolution. They were blamed along with Lin Biao, but Lin Biao was already dead. blaming the Cultural Revolution on leftists, not blaming it on Mao. And this is one of the important things about Deng coming to power. Deng obviously has huge resentments against Mao Zedong. I mean, for the Cultural Revolution, for his twice being purged, for the death, for the crippling of his son, and for all of these reasons. But he was very methodical in how he asserted his power. As I said, he rehabilitated the victims of the Cultural Revolution, allowed the Red Guards who had been sent down to the countryside to come back to the cities. He restored honor to the name of Liu Shaoqi, the president who had died in prison in 1969. And due to Deng Xiaoping and the other leaders who he rehabilitated, there was a very harsh verdict on the Cultural Revolution by 1978, a total rejection of its goals, of the chaos that it had caused. But, and here is the big but, Deng has to walk a very fine tightrope, that if he is going to consolidate his control over the party, and if the party is going to retain its control over this mammoth country, he needs unity. The party needs unity. And at the time that Deng comes to power, the party is viciously, viciously divided. Party members have been denouncing each other right and left. And what you have, at the time that Deng comes to power, you have one faction of senior leaders who believe deeply in Mao and everything that he has written and believe in him still as the guiding light of China. And you have another faction who despise Mao, who hate him for the Cultural Revolution, which they themselves were in their families were attacked from. They want to do away with him entirely. You can't please both sides. And if you pick one side over the other, if you repudiate Mao, you lose everyone who is loyal to him, and you risk the problems that happened in the Soviet Union after the repudiation of Stalin. If you embrace Mao uncritically, then everyone who has suffered from the Cultural Revolution will not follow you, and there'll be some sort of a revolution in the ranks. So due to Deng Xiaoping's diplomacy within the party, they found a way to keep Mao central while still taking steps to ensure that nothing like the Cultural Revolution could possibly happen again. Just in terms of the bitter feelings about Mao's legacy in the late 70s, this is from 1980, and this is a top official at the Ministry of Railways in China, reflecting on Mao and comparing him to the emperors of the old dynasties in China. And he says, even the worst emperors of the past always had a few loyal courtiers left in the end. So even the worst of the old emperors still had loyal members of their court at the time they died. But by the end of the Cultural Revolution, the people that loyally followed Chairman Mao's revolution were all eliminated. And in his later years, he really became profoundly alone. When this great revolutionary was dying, no comrades in arms were with him, and he died alone deep in his palace. He didn't need anyone, and finally everyone realized that they didn't need him. This is the bitterness that lingered after Mao's death. But as I said, because there was still so much loyalty to him, and because he served to unify the party, he stayed on as the figurehead of the party. His portrait was kept at on Tiananmen Square. His image was on the money. His philosophy was still taught in the schools. But Deng Xiaoping manages to stay in the shadow of Deng while completely turning around the policies of the government. So Deng was a pragmatist. He believed that things worked if they worked. Just because you thought something should work didn't help at all. So his chief doctrine was seek truth from facts. Again, seek truth from facts, which means that you need to study what works, that a policy has to be tested out. Look at the facts of the matter, look for evidence. And if the policy works, you continue it. And if it does not work, you stop it. You do not implement a policy simply because it seems ideologically correct. This, as you can see, is a complete subversion of what Mao had been working towards. Mao had put politics in command. Mao believed in voluntarism, that if you had the right political ideology, evidence didn't matter. You could make things work the way you wanted to. And Deng Xiaoping saw that this had been a colossal failure. So this became his central philosophy: seek truth from facts, which was a casting aside of Mao's theories and an implementation of evidence-based government. As a side note, seek truth from facts, this quotation originally came from something Mao said. And so Deng, by quoting this repeatedly, was quoting Mao, and he could show that he was still being loyal to Mao, even though he was actually completely undermining Mao's intended purpose in these various things. So follow in the lead of Mao in terms of the wording of things, but in reality, he took China on a new pragmatic course, based on modernizing. You have the four modernizations as one of your terms here. Modernizing agriculture, which had been destroyed in the communes. Agriculture had been the traditional basis of China's economy, but the communes just didn't work. So under Deng, they introduced machinery, electricity, irrigation, chemical fertilizers. They allowed farmers to have private plots. The state would still own the land, but you got the proceeds from it. They implemented personal incentives that you would get paid by your work unit or your commune based on how much labor you had put in. That was one of the four modernizations. The others were industry, science and technology, and the military. In industry, turning China into a major industrial country with a goal of, by the year 2000, being a world leader. Well, they have gone past that several times over, and there is absolutely no question today that China is an industrial leader in the world. This begins with the four modernizations. It begins with Deng in his era, going into the 1980s. Science and technology, dramatically increasing the number of scientists who had been ignored for the most part during the Cultural Revolution and after the anti-rightist campaign, giving them lab facilities, developing the universities, so that China could become a leader in science, as it has done today. And in the military, there were huge numbers of soldiers in Mao's China. There are 4.3 million members of the People's Liberation Army, but they had outdated equipment. Remember that image I showed you of the soldier? The one has an artillery shell, one has a gun, one has the little red book. The PLA believed that their ideology was their primary weapon, and so their actual guns were sort of outdated and useless. So this was the same question in the 1980s as China had after the Taiping Rebellion, when they wanted to modernize their military. Do we buy weapons from the West, or do we build them ourselves? And Deng followed a fairly similar path in that he developed a native arms industry based on a foreign model of the AK-47, which was a Russian weapon, but they started building them themselves. Going forward, and this is what I will leave you with today, going into the 1980s, we have Deng's version of a very pragmatic form of socialism, which, if you didn't know better, you might call it capitalism. Unleashing free enterprise, allowing business in very specific zones, allowing market forces to determine prices, reopening to international trade, all of the glimmers of the beginning of the huge economic powerhouse that China is today. These begin in the 1980s, but ironically being led by the Communist Party. And this is called socialism with Chinese characteristics, meaning it is going to be a uniquely Chinese form of socialism that's going to begin with capitalism. How do you justify that? How do you have a Communist Party leading capitalist reforms? Well, on the one hand, the party maintains strict control over ideology. The party maintains control over politics, over education, over the news media, and all of that, to keep a socialist mindset. People are still taught to emulate Lei Feng and work for the poor and devote themselves to the party and the motherland. So all of that is still in place. Those capitalist reforms, the justification for those, and this is the last thing that I'll give you today, the justification for those capitalist reforms is that they are a necessary first stage, and they are called the initial stage of socialism, that China must develop itself in a capitalist model first, And only after it reaches the peak of that can it then move into true socialism and then finally communism. This, you can see this as being sort of facetious, that really some of the leaders just want capitalism, but those who truly believe in it and believe in the party's leadership of it argue that Karl Marx's version of communism was for Western European states and for Russia, which were already highly developed capitalist countries. They already had strong industrial bases and big factories and things like that. China is different. China was a poor agrarian country with a weak industrial base. And so if they wanted to follow the path to communism, they had to start with that initial stage, which is capitalism. And that stage, as Deng and his followers stated, might last 100 years, but this is the stage that China is in now. So it looks like all-out capitalism, but it is overseen by the Communist Party, which still maintains certain socialist controls over society. So when we come back, we'll continue through the 1980s and the great hopes and the great dissent that also emerges in the 1980s. We do not have a lecture next week, just as a reminder. Monday is Patriots Day, so there's no UMass classes at all. Wednesday, we were originally scheduled for an exam that we won't be happening, but there will be a film for you to watch. So you won't be actually seeing my smiling face until a week after, and then we'll have our final 2 lectures on China from the 1980s up until today. Hope you're all doing great. Have a good time in section, and I will see you all soon.